Chapter 6. I hesitated, then said, "Is she the same Elaine Johnson who used to live in Boston?" "Uh-huh." Then I did know her. Not well, but she used to come into the bookstore all the time, and she used to come to author readings. "You didn't want to tell me this yesterday afternoon?" Honestly, it didn't occur to me that it was the same person. The name rang a bell, but it's a common name. "Okay," she said, but her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "What was she like, Elaine Johnson?" I pretended to think, just to buy a little time, but the truth was, Elaine was memorable. She had seriously thick glasses, I think you'd call them Coke bottles, and thinning hair, and she always wore what appeared to be handmade sweaters, even in summertime. But none of that was what had made her memorable. She was memorable because she was one of those people who take advantage of the vulnerable nature of retail employees by cornering them and subjecting them to endless monologues, more like diatribes, on her favorite subjects. Elaine's favorite subject was crime writers, who was a genius, who was merely good, and who was bad. "Fucking atrocious" was the phrase she generally used. And she used to come into the store every day and corner whatever employee she encountered first. It was exhausting and annoying, but we all figured out the best way to deal with her, which was to continue working while she talked, give her about 10 minutes, then tell her in no uncertain terms that her time was up. It sounds rude, but the thing is, Elaine Johnson was rude herself. She said outrageous things about the authors she didn't like. She was casually racist, openly homophobic, and surprisingly loved to comment on other people's appearances, despite her own. I think anyone who works in a bookstore, or any store, probably is used to dealing with difficult customers, including difficult customers who come in every day. The thing about Elaine Johnson was that she also showed up at all our author readings, and she was always the first to raise her hand, asking a question that subtly or not so subtly insulted the poor author on stage. We would always warn the authors in advance, but we'd also mention that she always bought a copy of the book to get it autographed, even when they were, according to her, a no-talent fraud. Most authors, I find, are willing to put up with an asshole if it means a book sale, especially a hardcover book sale. I knew that Elaine Johnson had moved to Rockland, Maine, because she told us about the move on a daily basis for about a year before it happened. Her sister had died and left her a house. On the day she finally left, my employees and I went out for a celebratory drink. "She was pretty abrasive," I said to Agent Mulvey. "She came to the store every day and cornered one of us to talk about the book she was reading. I remember now that she did move to Maine, but I didn't connect the name when you said it. I just knew her as Elaine, not Elaine Johnson." "Did she deserve to die?" she asked. I raised my eyebrows. "Did she deserve to die? Are you asking me personally? No, of course not." "No, sorry. I mean, you said she was an abrasive personality. It's clear, at least to me, that all the victims so far have been less than likable people. Did she fall into the category?" "She was definitely not likable. She told me once that lesbians made terrible writers because they didn't spend enough time with men who had superior intellects." "Oh." She used to say stuff just to get a rise, I think. Ultimately, she was sad and lonely, more so than a terrible person. "Did you know she had a weak heart?" After her surgery, I remember her pulling down the neck of her pilly sweater to show me the puckered scar on her wrinkled chest. I remember saying, "Please don't ever show that to me again," which got a laugh. Sometimes I thought that Elaine Johnson's act was just that, an act, and what she really craved was people being rude to her back. "It rings a bell," I said to Agent Mulvey. I remember there was a time when she didn't come into the store. We were all thrilled. But then she started to come back. I remember it was medical. The waiter had sidled over. Agent Mulvey's plate was spotless, and my eggs were untouched. He asked if everything was okay. "Sorry," I said. "It's fine. I'm still working on these." He cleared the agent's plate, and she ordered more coffee. I decided to make an attempt on my eggs, thinking it would look strange if I didn't. Agent Mulvey looked at her watch and asked me if I was going in to work. "I'll go in," I said. "I doubt I'll have any customers, but I'll check on Nero." "Oh, Nero," she said, with affection in her voice. I remembered that she had cats of her own and asked her, "Who's looking after your cats?" As soon as I said it, I realized that it was a very personal question. It also sounded as though I was trying to figure out if she was single. I wondered if she thought I was hitting on her. I wasn't a whole lot older than she was, 10 years maybe, although I did know that my hair, prematurely white, made me look a little older. "They're fine," she said, avoiding the question. "They have each other." I continued to eat, and she glanced at her phone, then put it face down back on the table. "I do have to ask you where you were the night of September 13th, the night that Elaine Johnson died?" "Of course," I said. What night was it?" "It was the 13th. "No, the day of the week." "Let me check." She picked her phone back up, scrolled for 10 seconds, then said, "It was a Saturday night." "I was away," I said. "In London." I take the same vacation every year, 2 weeks in London, usually at the beginning of September. It's low tourist season because the kids are back in school, but the weather is usually still good. Plus, it's an okay time to be away from the store. "Do you know the exact dates you were away?" she asked. If the 13th was Saturday, then I flew back the next day on Sunday, the 14th. I can send you the flights I was on if you'd like. I know it was basically the first 2 weeks in September. "Okay, thanks," she said, which I took to mean that she wanted me to send her my exact flights. "If Elaine Johnson was killed by Charlie," I said. "Yes?" "Then it makes it much more likely that Charlie is definitely using my list." "Yes, it does. And it means that he not only knows who you are, but that he knows people around you. I'm assuming it can't be a coincidence that one of the victims is someone you knew personally." "I don't think so," I said. "Is there anyone who has a grudge against you? Maybe an ex-employee? Someone who might have known that Elaine Johnson was a regular at Old Devil's?" "Not that I know of," I said. "There aren't that many ex-employees from the store, actually. I only need 2 extra people, and the 2 I have now have both been with me for over 2 years. "Can you tell me their names?" she said, pulling a notebook out from her bag. I gave her Emily's and Brandon's full names, and she wrote them down. "What can you tell me about them?" she said. I told her what I knew. It wasn't much. Emily Barsamian had graduated from Winslow College outside of Boston about 4 years ago and gotten an internship at the Boston Athenaeum, a prestigious and historic independent library. She'd supplemented her income by coming to work at Old Devil's for 20 hours a week. When the internship was finished, she upped her hours and had been with me ever since. I knew hardly anything about her personal life because she rarely talked, and when she did, it was only about books or sometimes movies. I suspected that she was a secret writer, but hadn't confirmed it. Brandon Weeks was my gregarious employee. He still lived with his mom and his sisters in Roxbury, and both Emily and I probably knew everything about him, certainly everything about his family and about his current girlfriend. When I'd hired him as extra help during the holiday season 2 years ago, I admit that I had doubts about whether he'd show up with any kind of regularity. But he stayed on, and as far as I remembered, had never missed a single day or even been late. "And that's it?" Agent Mulvey asked. "For current employees? Yes. I go in every day myself. And when I go on vacation, either we hire a temp, or Brian, my co-owner, comes in and does a few shifts. If you want, I'll put together a list of past employees and send it to you."
"Brian is Brian Murray?" she said.
"Yes, you know him?"
"I saw his name on your website. I've heard of him, yes."
Brian is a semi-famous writer who lives in the South End and who writes the Ellis Fitzgerald series. He's easily up to about 25 books by now. They don't sell as well as they used to, but Brian writes them anyway, keeping his female detective Ellis at a perpetual 35 years old and keeping both fashion and technology advancements out of his narratives. The books are set sometime in late 80s Boston, as was the TV series called Ellis that ran for 2 years and provided Brian with the townhouse he bought in the South End, his lake house in the far north of Maine, and enough extra money to invest in old devils.
"Include other people on your list if you think of them. Pissed off customers? Any exes of yours we should know about?"
"It's going to be a short list," I said. "My only ex is my wife, and she's dead."
"Oh, I'm sorry,"
she said, but it was clear from her expression she already had that information. "And I'll keep thinking about the books on the list."
"Thank you,"
she said.
"Don't hold back. Let me know any thoughts you have, even if they seem insignificant or unlikely. It can't hurt."
"Okay," I said, folding my napkin and putting it over the uneaten portion of my breakfast. "Are you checking out or are you staying here?"
"Checking out," she said. "Unless for some reason the train canceled, then I guess I'll spend one more night here. But I'm not leaving right now. You haven't told me if you looked at the unsolved crimes I gave you last night."
I told her that none of them had jumped out at me, except for possibly Daniel Gonzalez, the man who'd been shot while jogging.
"How does it relate to your list?" she asked.
"It probably doesn't, but it made me think of the Donna Tartt book, The Secret History. In that book, the killers wait for their victim at a place they think he might be hiking."
"I read that book in college," she said.
"So you remember?"
"Sort of. I thought they killed someone doing a sex ritual in the woods."
"That's the first murder. They kill a farmer. The second murder is the one I reference in the list. They push their friend off a cliff."
"Daniel Gonzalez was shot."
"I know. It's a long shot. It has more to do with the fact that he was out walking his dog. Maybe it's a walk he does every day or once a week. It probably has nothing to do—"
"No, it's helpful. I'll look into it further. There were several persons of interest in the Daniel Gonzalez case, including a former student who is still under investigation. But it does seem like a possibility."
"Was Daniel Gonzalez an asshole?" I said, for lack of a better word.
"That I don't know, but I'll check it out. It seems likely, though, if there were several persons of interest in his killing." "So that was the only case, the Gonzalez one?"
"Yes," I said. "I did think that you should look outside of unsolved homicides, though. Look at accidental drownings and also accidental overdoses. Oh, that reminds me." I opened my bike messenger bag and pulled out the 2 books I'd brought with me, the paperback copy of The Drowner that I'd reread the night before, plus a paperback copy of Malice Aforethought that I'd found in my personal collection that morning. It was a Pan Books paperback in very poor condition, the cover almost falling off. I slid both across to Agent Mulvey.
"Thanks," she said. "I'll make sure they get returned to you."
"Don't worry too much about it," I said. "Neither is irreplaceable. And I read The Drowner last night. Read it again, I mean, because it had been a while since I last read it."
"Oh yeah?"
she said.
"Any insights?"
"There are 2 murders in it. There's the woman who gets killed while swimming. She's pulled down below, basically what the cover is showing you. But there's a second murder, a really disturbing one. The killer, who's this very physically strong woman, almost supernaturally strong, kills a man by giving him a heart attack with her hand. She holds it rigid, like this," I demonstrated by holding up my hand, fingers extended, "and pushes it slowly up under his rib cage until she can feel his heart, and then she wrenches it." "Ugh," the agent said and made a face. I don't know if it's even possible, I said. And even if it was, I'm pretty sure an autopsy would show what happened.
I think so too, she said. I still think we should look for drownings. I think our Charlie would want to copy the drowning killing, especially since it's the title of the book.
Right, I said.
Did you get anything else from the book?
I didn't tell her how I hadn't remembered just how sexualized the killings were. That Angie, the insane murderer, imagined two personalities for herself, a Joan of Arc side in which her purity made her impervious to pain. But then there was a side to her that she called her red mare feeling, her back arched, her nipples erect, and how she experienced both of these personalities when she committed a murder. It made me wonder if all murderers needed to do this, needed to disassociate during the act, become someone else. Was Charlie like this? But what I said to Agent Mulvey was, "It's actually not a great book. I love John D. MacDonald, but except for the Angie character, this wasn't one of his best." She shrugged and put both the books in her own bag. I realized that my critical assessment of the book was not exactly relevant. Still, she looked up and said, "You've been incredibly helpful. Do you mind if I send you anything I might have for your opinion? And if you'd keep rereading the books." "Of course," I said. We exchanged emails, then stood, and she walked me to the entrance of the hotel. "I want to look at the weather," she said, stepping outside with me. The snow was barely falling now, but the city was transformed. Drifts of snow gathered in corners, the trees bent over. Even the brick walls of nearby buildings coated in white. "Good luck getting home," I said. We shook hands. I called her Agent Mulvey, and she asked me to call her Gwen. As I walked slowly away through the shin-high snow, I decided it was a good sign, her asking me to call her by her first name. Chapter 7. When I got to the store 20 minutes later, Emily Barsamian was under the awning, looking at her phone. "How long have you been here?" I asked. 20 minutes. When I didn't hear from you, I just figured we'd be open for regular hours." "Sorry. You should have sent me a text message." I said this, knowing that in 4 years she had never sent me a text message, and that she probably never would. "I didn't mind waiting," she said, as I opened the door, then followed her in. "It was my fault for forgetting my keys." Nero came over to greet us, meowing, and Emily crouched down to scratch his chin. I went behind the checkout desk and turned on the lights. Emily stood and removed her long green coat. Underneath, she wore what I had come to think of as her work uniform, a mid-length dark skirt, chunky boots, a vintage sweater over a button-up shirt, or occasionally a t-shirt. The t-shirts she wore provided rare clues as to Emily's likes and dislikes. Some of the shirts were book-related. She had one with a vintage cover of Shirley Jackson's "We Have Always Lived in the Castle," with an illustration of a black cat in tall green grass, and several were t-shirts for a band called the Decemberists. The previous summer, she wore a t-shirt that advertised "Summer Isle, May Day, 1973, and I spent all day with a nagging feeling that it sounded familiar. I finally asked her, and she told me it was referencing The Wicker Man, a horror film from the 1970s I hadn't seen in many years. "You're a horror fan?" I asked. As usual, when we spoke, she was looking at either my forehead or my chin. "I guess," she said. "What are your top 5?" I said, hoping to continue the conversation. She frowned briefly, thinking, then said, "Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, Black Christmas, the original one, Heavenly Creatures, and, The Cabin in the Woods, I guess." "I've seen 2 out of 5. What about The Shining?" She shook her head rapidly, and I thought she might elaborate, but that was the end of the conversation. I didn't mind that she was a private person. I was as well. And being a private person is a rare trait these days. Still, I did wonder about her interior life.
and I wondered if she had ambitions besides being a bookseller. As she hung up her damp coat, I asked her if it had been hard getting to the store. "I took the bus. It was fine," she said. She lived on the other side of the river, near Inman Square in Cambridge. All I knew about her living situation was that she shared a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 other Winslow College graduates. Emily went to the back, to the table where I stacked the new arrivals. Her primary job was updating and monitoring our online stores. We sold used books through eBay and Amazon and a site called Alibris and a few more that I didn't even know about. I used to do some of it myself, filling orders, but Emily had taken over completely. That was one of the reasons I was anxious about her future plans. If she ever left here, I'd be in big trouble. I stayed behind the counter and checked the phone for messages. There were none. Then logged on to the Old Devil's blog, something I rarely did these days. But the visit from Gwen Mulvey made me interested in taking a look. There were 211 total blog entries, the last one entered 2 months ago. It was called Staff Picks, and it was something I periodically forced Emily and Brandon to do. Write 2 sentences on the last book they'd read and loved. Brandon had picked Lee Child's last Jack Reacher novel, and Emily had written a quick blurb on Dorothy B. Hughes's In a Lonely Place. My pick had been Started Early, Took My Dog by Kate Atkinson. I hadn't read it, of course, but I'd read enough reviews and summaries to feel as though I had. Also, I was fond of the title. I spent the next hour or so scrolling backward through blog entries, and it was like living the past 10 years of my life in reverse. There was John Haley's first and last entry, posted on the week he left the store, leaving me in charge. He'd sold Old Devils and all its stock to Brian Murray and me in 2012. Brian had put up most of the capital, but given me 50% ownership share since I'd be the one running it. So far it had worked out. I thought at first that Brian would want to be more involved than he was, but that hadn't been the case. He came to the store for our annual holiday party, along with attending almost all our readings, but other than that he has left me in charge, except for those 2 weeks a year when I take my annual trip to London. I did see Brian frequently, though. It took him about 2 months to write an entry in his Ellis Fitzgerald series. The rest of the year he called his drinking vacation, most of which he spent on a leather-padded stool at the small bar of the Beacon Hill Hotel. I stopped in often to have a drink with him, although I tried to do it early in the evening. If I arrived too late, Brian, a habitual storyteller, would play his greatest hits for me, stories I'd heard 100 times already. I scrolled farther back through the posts, noting the absence of any from 5 years ago, the year my wife died. The last entry before that event had been a list I'd written called Mysteries for a Cold Winter Night, posted on December 22nd, 2009. My wife died in the early morning hours of January 1st, 2010. She'd been in a car accident, sliding off an overpass on Route 2 while inebriated. They'd shown me pictures for identification purposes, a white sheet covering her head from the eyebrows up. Her face looked unmarked, even though I imagined her skull had completely collapsed from the impact. I read the list of mysteries I'd selected, all ones that took place in wintertime or during a storm. At this point in my blog writing career, I was happy to just list books and not describe them. This was my post. The Sitterford Mystery, 1931, by Agatha Christie. The Nine Tailors, 1934, by Dorothy L. Sayers. The Corpse in the Snowman, 1941, by Nicholas Blake. Tied Up in Tinsel, 1972, by Nio Marsh. The Shining, 1977, by Stephen King. Gorky Park, 1981, by Martin Cruz Smith. Smilla's Sense of Snow, 1992, by Peter Hoog. A Simple Plan, 1993, by Scott Smith. The Ice Harvest, 2000, by Scott Phillips. Raven Black, 2006, by Anne Cleeves.
I remembered putting it together, remembered worrying about including The Shining, because it was a horror novel and not at all a mystery, but included it anyway because it was a book I loved. It was strange to remember such minutiae, these insignificant thoughts I'd had less than 2 weeks before my world would change forever. If I could go back to late December of that year, then I would never have written this list. I would have spent all my time fighting tooth and nail for my wife, telling her that I knew about her affair, that I knew she was doing drugs again, telling her I forgave her, and that she could come back to me. Who knows if any of it would have made a difference, but at least I would have tried. I scrolled back some more, found another list, crime novels about cheating, and quickly checked the date. I didn't officially know about my wife at that point, but I must have guessed, must have known something was going on at a gut level. I kept scrolling backward, the blog posts coming more and more frequently as I reached the years when I'd been better at keeping the blog updated. I thought, not for the first time, why does everything need to be a list? What compels us to do that? It was something I'd been doing ever since I became an obsessed reader, ever since I started spending all my money at Annie's book swap. 10 favorite books, 10 scariest books, best James Bond novels, best Roald Dahl. I suppose I know why I did it back then. It doesn't take a psychology degree to understand that it was a way of giving myself an identity. Because if I wasn't a 12-year-old who'd already read every single Dick Francis novel and could name the 5 best, then I was just a lonely kid without friends, with a distant mother and a father who drank too much. That was my identity. And who wants that? So I guess the question is, why keep doing it? Making lists, even after I was living in Boston, had a good job, was married, and in love? Why wasn't all that enough? Eventually, I made it all the way back to the start of the blog, to 8 Perfect Murders. I'd read it so many times in the past 24 hours that I didn't need to read it again. The front door opened, and I lifted my head. It was a middle-aged couple, both encased in puffy winter coats with hoods. They were probably already large under their coats, but the added layers rendered them almost spherical. I had to walk single file through the door. When their hoods were down and their parkas unzipped, they approached me, smiling, introduced themselves as Mike and Becky Swanson from Minnesota. I recognized them immediately as a certain kind of customer we occasionally get, fanatical mystery readers who make a point to visit us during their trip to Boston. Old Devil's is not a famous store, but we are famous to a certain kind of reader. "You brought your weather with you," I said, and they both laughed, told me how they'd been planning on coming to Boston for years. "Got to see Cheers, got to try some clam chowder, and definitely got to come to Old Devil's," the man said. "Where's Nero?" his wife said, and as if on cue, Nero rounded the new releases shelf and visited the pair. We all had to chip in, I guess. Mike and Becky left an hour and a half later. It was 90% talking and 10% shopping, although they did buy $100 worth of signed hardcovers, giving me their address in East Grand Forks so that we could mail the books to them. "We forgot to leave any room in our suitcases," Becky said. It had stopped snowing when they left. They had taken several of our bookmarks with them as souvenirs, plus I'd steered them to a few restaurants in the nearby area that were better than Cheers. As I held the door for them, Brandon arrived, dressed only in a hooded sweatshirt, although he was wearing gloves and a woolly hat under the hood. I'd forgotten he was scheduled to come in today. "You look surprised," he said. "It's Friday." "I know," I said. "Thank God it's Friday," he added in his booming voice, stretching the vowel sound on the word God to an impressive length. "And thank God I've got work to go to, so I don't have to be home all day." "Your class was canceled?" I asked. "Oh, yeah," he said. He was taking business classes, mostly in the mornings, and had been since he'd started working at the bookstore. Last I checked, he would graduate soon, and I knew I'd most likely lose him. It was going to be fine, but I was going to miss his nonstop chatter. It was a nice counterpoint to Emily's silence. My silence as well, I guess. He pulled a paperback, Richard Stark's The Hunter, from the pouch at the front of the hoodie, and handed it to me. "Effing awesome," he said. When he'd first started at the store, I had to keep reminding him not to swear because of the customers, so he'd amended his ways. He'd borrowed the book from the store at my suggestion just 2 days earlier. Between working full-time and going to school and maintaining, according to him, a pretty active social life, he also managed to read about 3 books a week. I looked at the paperback, one in which the name of the book had been changed to Point Blank in order to reflect the Lee Marvin movie that was made in 1967. "That's the way I got it, Mal," he said, meaning the condition of the book. The borrow policy for employees meant they could take any book home to read just so long as they didn't add any extra wear to it. "No, it looks fine," I said. "Yeah, it does," Brandon said, then shouted, "Emily!" in 3 equally accented syllables. She came out from the back, and Brandon hugged her, something he occasionally did if it had been more than a day since he'd last been in the store. He only hugged me at the holiday party, and at the few occasions when we'd close up the shop, then grab a quick beer at the Sevens. I am not a natural hugger, even though it is now standard greeting protocol among men of my generation. I can't get the movements down, especially if the hug involves one of those manly backslaps. Claire, my wife, when I told her about this particular anxiety, started to practice with me. For a while there, we'd greet each other at home with a man hug. Brandon followed Emily into the back room where he took the mail order list and began to assemble piles of books for shipping. A huge advantage of having the same employees here for so long is that I hardly ever have to tell them what to do. Because of their loyalty, I pay them far more than I suspect other retail places offer. I don't need the store to make a big profit, and I don't think Brian Murray cares that much either. He's just happy to be able to call a mystery bookstore his own, or half his own. I listened to Brandon tell Emily the entire plot of The Hunter while I updated new releases. 4 more customers came in, all alone. A Japanese tourist, a regular named Joe Staley, a 20-something guy I knew by sight who always browsed through the horror section and never bought anything, plus a woman who had clearly come in only to escape the cold outside. I checked my phone for the weather. The snow was done now, but temperatures were dropping over the next few days into the teens. All the snow that had fallen was going to harden into piles of ice, black with city grime. I went back to my computer to check on emails, then glanced again at the blog site, still on the 8 Perfect Murders list. A sort of byline at the bottom of the list said that it was posted by Malcolm Kershaw, then gave the date and time of the post, then indicated that there were 3 comments. I remembered there being only 2, so I clicked through to read them. The latest comment was posted less than 24 hours earlier at 3 a.m. from a user named Dr. Shepard and read, "I am halfway through your list. Strangers on a Train, done. The ABC Murders, finally finished. Double Indemnity, kaput. Deathtrap, saw the film. When I'm finished with the list, it won't be long now, I'll get in touch. Or do you already know who I am?" Chapter 8. That night I cooked myself the pork chop that was in the refrigerator, although I was still shaken, and I overcooked it. Its sides curled up, and it was as tough as jerky. Since late afternoon and through until our closing time of 7, I hadn't been able to stop thinking about that 3rd comment on the Perfect Murders blog post. I must have read it 30 times now, parsing every word. The name used by whoever had written the post, Dr. Shepard, nagged at me until I finally Googled it.
It was the name of the narrator in Agatha Christie's famous novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. That was the book that put Christie on the map, so to speak. Written in 1926, it is most famous for a very clever plot twist. The book is told in first person from the point of view of Shepherd, a country village doctor and a neighbor of Hercule Poirot's. Honestly, I don't remember anything about the crime itself, except for the name of the victim, obviously. What I do remember is that at the end of the novel, it is revealed the narrator is the actual murderer. When I got home, I went immediately to my bookshelf and found my copy of Christie's book. I owned the Penguin paperback edition, one from the 1950s with the simple green cover and no artwork. I flipped through to see if it would somehow jog my memory as to the actual plot, but it didn't, and I decided I'd read it that night. Was it possible that whoever posted the comment was really only a reader, working his or her way through my list? I think it was a possibility, a very slim one, except for the fact of the books mentioned as having been read. They were the books for which there had already been a crime. The ABC murders, Double Indemnity, and Deathtrap. Strangers on a Train as well, although Gwen Mulvey doesn't know all about that one yet. I do, and someone else does as well. If these words are ever read, then I am sure that the reader might have already guessed that I have more to do with these crimes than I've been letting on. It's not as though there haven't been clues. For instance, why did my heart beat faster when Gwen Mulvey first began interviewing me? Why didn't I immediately tell her that I knew who Elaine Johnson was? Why did I only eat 2 bites of my sandwich the night after I was visited by the FBI agent? Why do I dream of being chased? Why did I not immediately tell Gwen about the comment from Dr. Shepherd? And a really astute reader might even have noticed that my name, shortened, is Mal. French, of course, for bad. That's taking it too far, though, because that really is my name. I've changed some names for the purposes of this narrative, but not my own. It is time to tell the truth. It is time to speak of Claire. That was her real name as well. Claire Mallory, who grew up in a wealthy town in Fairfield County, Connecticut, one of 3 sisters. Her parents were not particularly good people, but they weren't bad enough to really figure into this story. They were well off and shallow. Her mother, in particular, was obsessed with all 3 of her daughters' attractiveness and weight, and because she obsessed about it, that meant their father, devoid of any independent thoughts himself, agreed with her. They sent their children to summer camps in Maine and to fancy private schools, and Claire, who was the oldest, chose to go to Boston University because she wanted to be in a city, and both New York City and Hartford felt too close to where she'd grown up. At BU, she majored in film and television, wanting to be a documentary filmmaker. Her first year was okay, but in her second year, prompted by a boyfriend majoring in theater arts, she got heavily into drugs, particularly cocaine. As her habit grew, she began to have panic attacks, and that caused her to drink excessively. She stopped going to classes, was put on academic probation, briefly rebounded, then failed out her junior year. Her parents tried hard to get her to come home, but she stayed in Boston instead, renting an apartment in Allston and getting a job at the Red Line bookstore, where I'd just been promoted to manager. It was love at first sight, really. At least for me. When she came in to interview, it was clear that she was nervous, her hands trembling slightly, and she kept yawning, which seemed weird, but I was able to recognize it as a sign of extreme anxiety. She sat on a swivel chair in Mort's office, her hands resting on her thighs. She wore a corduroy skirt and dark leggings, plus a turtleneck. She was thin, noticeably so, and with a long neck. Her head seemed too big for her body, her face almost perfectly round. She had dark brown eyes, a thin nose, and lips that looked puffy and bitten. Her hair was very dark, cut in what I thought of as a bob.
It looked like a dated style to me, something an intrepid amateur detective might wear in a 1930s film. She was so pretty that a dull throb had taken up residence in my solar plexus. I asked her about work experience. She had very little, but during the past few summers she'd worked at a Walden Books at her local mall down in Connecticut. "Who are your favorite writers?" I'd asked, and she looked surprised at the question.
"Janet Frame," she said. "Virginia Woolf, Jeanette Winterson." She thought for a while. "I read poetry as well. Adrienne Rich, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton."
"Sylvia Plath?" I'd asked, and inwardly cringed. It sounded stupid, mentioning the most famous confessional female poet, as though I were somehow reminding her of the name. "Sure," she said, then asked me who my favorite writers were. I told her. We kept talking this way, about writers, for the next hour, and I realized I'd only asked her one question about the actual job. "What hours will you be available?" I said.
"Oh,"
she touched her cheek when she thought. I noticed it right away, not aware in that moment of how many times I'd see her make that gesture, and how eventually I would see it not just as something endearing and individual, but as something worrying.
"I don't know why I'm thinking about it," she said, laughing. "Any hours?"
It was 6 weeks before I got up the nerve to actually ask her out. Even then, I'd framed it as a work outing. Ruth Rendell was doing an event at the Boston Public Library, and I asked Claire if she wanted to join me. She'd said yes, then added, "I haven't read her books, but if you like them, I should." A sentence that I analyzed in the following days, the way a graduate student might pick apart a Shakespeare sonnet. "Maybe we can get a drink afterward," I said, and my own voice in my head sounded relatively calm.
"Sure," she said.
It was a November night, dark by the time we were diagonally crossing Copley Square to get to the library, and the park was littered with brittle leaves. We sat toward the back of the small auditorium. Ruth Rendell was interviewed by a local radio personality who was far too interested in himself. Still, it was an interesting conversation, and afterward Claire and I walked to the poorhouse for a drink, sitting in a corner booth until closing time. We talked about books, of course, and the other employees at the bookstore. Nothing personal. But when we were standing in front of her apartment building in Alston at 2 a.m, the wind causing us both to shiver, she said before we'd even kissed, "I'm a bad idea." "What do you mean?" I laughed.
"I mean, whatever ideas you're having about me are bad ones. I've got issues."
"I don't care," I said.
"Okay," she said,
and I followed her inside. I'd had 2 girlfriends in college, one of whom was a German exchange student studying for a year in Amherst, and the other a freshman when I was a senior, a girl from Holton, Maine, who joined the literary magazine that I was then editing. I had roughly the same feelings toward both of them. What drew me to them was the fact that they were drawn to me. Both were nervous talkers, and since I tended on the quiet side, it had worked out. When Petra returned to Germany, I told her that I'd be visiting her as soon as possible. Her response, that she never expected our relationship to last beyond her time in America, was both confusing and somehow an enormous relief. I had been under the impression that she was in love with me. 2 years later, when I'd graduated, I'd told Ruth Porter, my freshman girlfriend, that now that I was moving to Boston and she was staying in Amherst, we should end the relationship. I'd expected a happy indifference on her part, but she looked as though I'd shot her in the stomach. Through a series of wrenching conversations, I did finally manage to break up with her, realizing that I'd also broken her heart. I decided then that I was not good at reading women, or maybe just people in general. So when I stepped into Claire Mallory's apartment, and when we began to kiss before we'd even gotten our jackets off, I told her, "Just so you know, I think I'm terrible at nonverbal cues. I need you to tell me everything." She laughed.
Are you sure?
Yes, please, I said, and it was all I could do to not tell her I was already in love with her.
Okay, I'll tell you everything.
She started that night. In bed with the dawn light filling her 2 dusty bedroom windows, she told me how her middle school science teacher had molested her over the course of 2 years. You didn't tell anyone? I said.
No,
she said.
It's a cliché, but I was ashamed. I thought it was my fault, and I kept telling myself that he wasn't having sex with me, at least. We'd never even kiss. In fact, he was nice to me, in a way, both him and his wife. But when he got me alone, he'd always managed to somehow get behind me, pull me in for a hug, put one hand in my shirt and the other down my jeans. I think he used to come that way. But he never took my clothes off, or his, and afterward he'd always look a little sheepish, say something like, "That was nice," and then he'd change the subject.
Jesus, I'd said.
It wasn't a huge deal, she said. Other shitty things have happened to me, and that was just one of them. I sometimes think my mom fucked me up even more than my molester did. She had tattoos on the insides of her arms and along either side of her ribcage. Just straight lines, dark and thin. I asked her about them, and she told me she loved the feeling of getting a tattoo but could never pick any image that she'd want on her body forever. So she just got lines, one at a time. I thought they were beautiful, just as I thought her body, unhealthily thin, probably, was also beautiful. I think our relationship worked so well for a time because I never judged her, never questioned what she told me. I knew she had issues, that she drank too much, although she hadn't taken drugs in close to a year, and that she ate too little, and that sometimes when we had sex, I could feel her wanting me to objectify her, that it wasn't always enough to have normal, loving sex, that she wanted more. When she was drunk, she'd turn her back to me, pull my hands around to her front, grind herself up against me, and it was impossible for me to not think of her teacher in middle school and wonder if she was thinking of him as well. But all this darkness, if that's what it's even called, was only part of what we had for the first 3 years we were together. Most of what we had was an incredible closeness, the happiness that comes with finding someone who seems to fit inside of you like a key in a lock. That's the best metaphor I can come up with. I know it's trite, but it's also true. And it was the only time that this type of connection ever happened with me, then or since. We got married in Las Vegas, our witness a blackjack dealer we'd met 5 minutes earlier. The major reason we eloped was because Claire could not deal with the prospect of her mother hijacking her own wedding. It was fine with me. My own mother had died 3 years prior from lung cancer. She'd never smoked a day in her life, but my father, the chain smoker, was still alive, of course, now living in Fort Myers, Florida, and still, as far as I knew, an alcoholic and a 3-packs-a-day Winston man. After Claire and I were married, we moved to Somerville together, rented the middle floor of a triple-decker near Union Square. Claire had left Redline Bookstore by this point, getting an administrative job at Somerville's cable access station, where she had begun to make short documentary films. And a year later, after Redline shuttered its doors, I got the job at Old Devil's. I was 29 years old and felt as though I'd found the job that I would have for the rest of my life. It wasn't so easy for Claire. She hated her job at the cable station, but she didn't have a college degree, and every position she was interested in required one. She decided to go back to school part-time at Emerson College and finish an undergraduate degree. And she got work as a bartender at a divey club in Central Square. I used to visit her there, sitting long hours at the bar, suffering through over-amplified punk bands, drinking Guinness, and watching my wife get ogled by hipsters in dark-rimmed glasses and skinny jeans. I developed the ability to read entire novels while ignoring the thunderous amateurs on stage. Even though I wasn't older than the other patrons of the bar, I felt older, what with my book and my graying hair.
The other bartenders referred to me as Claire's old man, and Claire started calling me old man as well. I think that for a time, my wife loved my presence at her bar. At the end of her shift, she'd join me in having a beer, and then we'd walk back home together, arm in arm, through the dark, cluttered streets of Cambridge and Somerville. But something changed in 2007. Claire's sister Julie was getting married, and Claire was suddenly embroiled back with her family, recruited in to serve as a buffer between her youngest sister and her mother. She lost the weight she'd gained over the last few years and added several new tattooed lines to the inside of her left thigh. Also, she fell in love with a new bartender named Patrick Yates. Chapter 9. After my bad dinner, I got into bed early with my Penguin edition of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept rereading the first page, my mind skipping around between thoughts of my wife and wondering who had written the comment on my blog post. I filled my lungs with the stale air of my apartment, then slowly exhaled. Why did he call himself Dr. Shepard? Because he was the killer, right? Still, that didn't mean I needed to try and read the book. I put it on my nightstand where I kept a stack of poetry collections. That's what I read at night now, before I go to sleep. Even if I'm currently into a literary biography, even though I rarely read crime, I do read biographies of crime writers. Or something on European history. The last words I read before I try to fall asleep are the words of poets. All poems, all works of art, really, seem like cries of help to me, but especially poetry. When they are good, and I do believe there are very few good poems, reading them is like having a long-dead stranger whisper in your ear, trying to be heard. I got out of bed and went to my bookshelf to find an anthology of poems that contained one of my favorites, Winter Nightfall by Sir John Squire. I could probably recite it by heart, but I wanted to see the words. When I found a poem I loved, I would read it again and again. For one entire year, I must have read Sylvia Plath's Black Rook in Rainy Weather every night before I fell asleep. Lately, I'd been reading Peter Porter's An Exequy, even though I understood less than half of it. I do not have a critical mind for poems, but I react to them. Back in bed, I read the Squire poem, then shut my eyes and let the final words gallop over me, and the slop of my footsteps in this desolate country's cadaverous clay, again and again, like a mantra. I thought some more of my wife and the decisions that I made. When Patrick Yates came into her life, and I actually remember the date because it was March 31st, my birthday, I knew right away that something momentous had occurred. Claire had done the afternoon shift that day at the bar, so as to get out early and take me to the East Coast Grill for my birthday dinner. "We finally hired a new bartender," she said. "Oh." "Patrick. I started training him today. He seems okay." The way she said his name, a combination of hesitancy and boldness, and I knew right away that he had made an impression on her. My body felt as though an almost imperceptible electric current had coursed through it. "Does he have experience?" I asked as I tipped an oyster back. "He worked at a pub in Australia for a year, so that's something. I thought of you because he has a tattoo of Edgar Allan Poe on his right shoulder." I was not a jealous husband, but I was also aware that Claire, unlike myself, was never going to go through life content with just me. She'd been with numerous men in college, and she'd admitted more than once that she'd go through periods when every time she met a man, or every time she'd pass a man on the street, she'd wonder if that man wanted her, and then she'd obsess over what these men might think about doing to her. I'd listen to these confessions and tell myself that it was better that she told me, better than the alternative, better than secrets. She did have a therapist, a woman she referred to as Dr. Martha, whom she saw once every 2 weeks, but after her appointments she'd be in a dark mood, sometimes for days, and I wondered if it was worth it. Part of me had always told myself that one day Claire would cheat. Or maybe not cheat, but that she would fall for someone else. And I'd accepted that. And hearing about Patrick, I knew that day had come. It scared me, but I had already decided what to do. Claire was my wife. She would always be my wife, and I would stand by her no matter what. It provided a sense of comfort, knowing that I was in it for the long haul, no matter what. She did have an affair with Patrick, at least an emotional one, although I suspect it tipped over into the physical on at least a couple of occasions. I waited patiently, like the wife of a sea captain, hoping that she'd make it alive through the storm. I wonder sometimes if I should have fought more, threatened to leave, berated her when she came home 2 hours after the bar had closed, her clothes smelling of the American spirits that he smoked, her breath sharp with gin. But I didn't. That wasn't my choice. I waited for her to come back to me, and one night, a hot summer night in August, she did. I had just arrived home from the bookstore, and she was sitting on our sofa, head bowed, tears in her eyes. "I've been such an asshole," she said. "A little bit." "Will you ever forgive me?" "I will always forgive you," I said. Later that night, she asked me if I wanted details, and I said only if she needed to say them out loud. "God, no," she said. "I'm done with it." I found out later, but not from Claire, that Patrick Yates had disappeared after cleaning out the till on a Saturday night, and that at least 3 other female bartenders at the club had all been devastated by his departure. After that incident, it got better between Claire and me, although things were worse with her. She quit the club and dropped out of Emerson College. For a while, she did a few shifts at Old Devil's, but then she got another job as a bartender at an upscale restaurant in the Back Bay. The money was good, but she felt frustrated with the lack of creativity in her life. "I don't want to be a bartender for the rest of my life. I want to make films, but I need to go to school to do that." "You don't have to go to school," I said. "You could just make a film." And that's what she did. There were her evening shifts at the restaurant, and during the daytime she made short documentary films. One about tattoo artists, one about the polyamory community in Davis Square, even one about the Old Devil's bookstore. She posted them on YouTube, and that was where Eric Atwell found her. Atwell ran what he called an innovation incubator outside of Boston in a renovated farmhouse in Southwell. He offered free workspace and occasional bedrooms to young creatives in return for a percentage of their final product's profits. He contacted Claire, told her he liked her tattoo documentary, and asked if she'd film a promotional video for his incubator. Unlike with Patrick Yates, I didn't get a bad feeling about Eric Atwell when Claire first started telling me about him. She said he was a cliché, a 50-year-old who acted 30, someone who clearly liked to surround himself with young people, preferably sycophants. "Sounds like a creep," I said. "I don't know. More like a con man. I think he's just really hoping to stumble into the next big thing and make a quick buck." She spent a weekend at the farmhouse. The name of his company was Black Barn Enterprises, and when she returned, I sensed that something had changed in her. She was jumpy, a little irritated, but also somewhat more affectionate with me. A few days after the weekend, Claire woke me up in the middle of the night and asked me, "Why do you love me?" "I don't know," I said. "I just do." "You must have reasons." "If I had reasons to love you, then there'd be reasons for me not to love you." "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I'm tired." "No, tell me. I'm curious." "Okay. So, if I loved you because you're beautiful, then that would mean I wouldn't love you anymore if you had some kind of accident that disfigured your face." "Or simply grew old." "Right, or grew old. And if I loved you because you're a good person, then that would mean I would stop loving you if you did something bad. And that wouldn't happen."
"You're way too good for me," she said, but she laughed.
"What do you love about me?" I said.
"Your youthful good looks," she said, laughing some more. "Actually, I love you because you're an old soul in a young man."
"And one day I'll be an old soul in an old man."
"I can't wait," she said.
Because I worked mostly during the daytime and she tended to work night shifts at the restaurant, it took me a while to find out that she had kept going back out to Southwell during the daytime hours. I started keeping track of the mileage on her Subaru. I felt bad spying in that way, but my suspicions turned out to be correct. It was clear that she was going out to Southwell 2 or 3 times a week. I assumed she was having an affair either with Atwell or maybe with one of Atwell's tenants. It didn't occur to me, at least not in those first few weeks, that she'd been going to Black Barn Enterprises for another reason, until I realized that the normally skin-tight jeans she wore to work were beginning to look baggy around her waist. I found her cocaine, plus a small pill box filled with an assortment of pills, in one of the compartments of the jewelry box she'd inherited from her grandmother. Later, after I'd confronted her, she told me how that first weekend at Black Barn, Atwell had thrown a dinner party with a ton of great wine. When she told him she was ready for bed, he'd talked her into a small amount of coke just to keep the party going. The next day, after she'd finished getting footage for her film, he'd thanked her by giving her a bottle of the Sancerre they'd been drinking the night before, plus a half gram of the cocaine. He'd also explained to Claire that he had devised a system for his drug use, spreading it out so as to not get addicted. He convinced her it was okay, so long as you followed his scientific schedule. If I'd initially known that Claire's trips out to Southwell were for drugs and not for sex, I might have tried to intervene sooner. As it was, by the time I was hearing about it, Claire was a full-blown addict again. I decided to do what I always did. I decided to wait it out in hopes that she would eventually agree to quit or to go to rehab. I know how it sounds. I know that maybe if I'd done something, given her an ultimatum, contacted her parents, gotten her friends involved, anything, that maybe the outcome would have been different. I still think about this all the time. When I was a teenager, I remember asking my mom why she put up with my father's drinking. She'd frowned, not because she was upset, but because she was confused. "What choice do I have?" she'd finally said. "You could leave him." She shook her head. "I'd rather wait for him." "Even if you have to wait forever?" I said. She nodded in response. That was how I felt about Claire during those moments when she wasn't fully mine. I was waiting for her. When the 2 uniformed officers knocked on my apartment door early on the first day of 2010, I knew that she was dead before either of them spoke. "Okay," I remember saying after they'd delivered the news that she'd been in a car accident at 3 in the morning and that she'd been killed instantly. "Was anyone else hurt?" I asked. "No, she was alone, and no other vehicles were involved in the accident." "Okay," I said again, and went to shut the door, figuring that the police were done with me. But they stopped me from closing the door, explained that I needed to come down to the station for identification purposes. 3 months later, I found a journal she'd been keeping. It was hidden behind a number of larger hardcovers in the section of our bookshelf that she had claimed for herself. I almost burned it without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me, and one wet spring evening, I bought myself a 6-pack of Newcastle Brown, settled in, and read the entire contents. Chapter 10. Even though I don't read contemporary mysteries anymore, I keep up with the trends. I am well aware that Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn has changed the industry, that unreliable narrators are suddenly popular, along with domestic suspense, with books that posit the question of whether we can really trust anyone, especially the ones closest to us. Some of the reviews I read make it sound as though this is a recent phenomenon, as though the idea of discovering a spouse's secrets constituted something new, or that the omission of facts from a narrative hadn't been the bedrock upon which psychological thrillers have been built for over a century. The narrator of Rebecca, a novel published in 1938, never even gave the readers her name. The thing is, and maybe I'm biased by all those years I've spent in fictional realms built on deceit, I don't trust narrators any more than I trust the actual people in my life. We never get the whole truth. Not from anybody. When we first meet someone, before words are ever spoken, there are already lies and half-truths. The clothes we wear cover the truth of our bodies, but they also present who we want to be to the world. They are fabrications, figuratively and literally. So I wasn't surprised when I found my wife's secret journal, and I wasn't surprised that there were things inside it that she'd never told me. Many things. For the purposes of this story, of my story, I won't go into everything that I discovered from reading the journal. She didn't want the world to know, and I don't either. But I do need to record what happened between Claire and Eric Atwell. Not surprisingly, they had been sexually involved. It wasn't a romantic liaison. Claire had become addicted to cocaine, and after a time during which Atwell had been furnishing it free of charge, he began to ask for money. She and I had shared one bank account together, for rent, for household expenses, for vacations. But we each had separate accounts as well, and hers had been emptied in about the space of 3 weeks. After that, she had paid Atwell in sexual favors. It was his idea. Without going into detail, some of what he asked her to do was truly demeaning. At one point, she told him about her bad experience with Mr. Clifton, the middle school teacher. I could see the excitement in his eyes, she wrote. I read the rest of the journal. Then, the following weekend, I drove out to Walden Pond in Concord, passing through Southwell. The lot was nearly empty. It was 10 degrees outside, the pond frozen, the skies above a chalky white. I walked along a trail that climbed a ridge above the pond, then doused the journal in kerosene and burned it in a clearing, stomping on the remains until the book was nothing more than a crater of black soot in the snow and ashes in the air. I never regretted destroying Claire's journal, although sometimes to this day I regret having read it. When I moved from our apartment in Somerville to the studio in Beacon Hill, I got rid of everything else that remained of Claire. Her clothes, the furniture she'd bought for our place, her school yearbooks. I kept a few of her books, her childhood copy of A Wrinkle in Time, an annotated paperback of Anne Sexton's collected poetry that she'd bought for a class during her freshman year at Boston University. That book is on my bedside table, always. Sometimes I read the poems inside, but mostly I look at Claire's notes and doodles, the lines and the words she'd underlined. Sometimes I touch the indentations that her ballpoint pen made on the page. Mostly, these days, I just like that the book is there, within easy reach. It's been 5 years since she died, but I talk to her more now in my head than I did immediately after she died. I talked to her the night I got into bed with Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, told her all about the list and the visit from Agent Mulvey, and what it felt like to be reading these books again. I woke around 8:30 in the morning, surprised that I'd gotten any sleep at all. I'd forgotten to pull the curtains in my apartment, and bright, hard sunlight was flooding in. At the window, I looked outside toward the irregular roofline across the street, now covered with snow, icicles decorating the gutters. There were spidery lines of frost on the outside of the windows, and the street below had the grayish pallor that meant it was incredibly cold outside. I checked my phone, and it was currently registering 1 degree above zero. I almost considered sending emails to Emily and Brandon, letting them know that they could take the day off, that it was too cold to ask them to come in, but changed my mind. I bundled up and walked down to Charles Street, to a cafe that served oatmeal. I was at a corner table reading a copy of yesterday's Globe that had been sitting on the table when my cell phone rang.
Malcolm, it's Gwen.
Hi, I said.
Were you sleeping?
Oh, no, I'm getting breakfast. I'm about to go into the store. Are you still in Boston?
No, I got home yesterday afternoon and all the books I'd ordered had arrived, so last night I read Strangers on a Train.
Yeah, and?
I'd love to talk with you about it. Is there a good time?
Can I call you back when I get to the store? I said. My oatmeal had just arrived, steam pouring from the bowl.
Sure, she said. Call me back.
After finishing breakfast, I went to Old Devil's. Emily was already there, and Nero had been fed. You're here early? I said.
Remember that I'm leaving early.
Oh, right, I said, although I hadn't remembered that.
Mr. Popovich complained again,
she said, rubbing her hands together.
He wants to return his last shipment.
The whole shipment?
Yep. He says they were all improperly graded.
David Popovich was a collector who lived in New Mexico, but all of us at the bookstore felt like he might as well live next door. He bought a ton of books from us and returned half of them at least. He occasionally called to complain, but mostly he sent us snide emails. Cut him off, I said.
What?
Write him back and tell him that we'll accept whatever returns he has, but that he can't order through us anymore. I'm done with him.
You serious?
Yes. Would you rather I write the email?
No, I'm happy to do it. Should I CC you?
Sure, I said. Banishing Popovich would probably hurt our bottom line in the end, but for the moment I didn't care. And it felt good. Before calling Gwen back, I sent an email to a publicist at Random House that I'd been ignoring and confirmed a date for her author to come and give a reading in March. Then I opened up the glass case and got our first edition copy of Strangers on a Train, bringing it back with me to the phone. Its cover was deep blue, garishly illustrated with a close-up of a man's face and a sickly-looking woman with red hair. Gwen picked up after one ring. Hi, Gwen, I said, and her first name sounded strange coming out of my mouth.
Thanks for calling me back. So, this book.
What did you think?
Bleak. I knew the story because of the movie, but the book was different. Darker, I thought. And do both the men commit murders in the movie?
I tried to remember. I don't think so, I said. No, definitely not. I think the main character in the movie, the tennis player, almost kills the father, but doesn't. That probably had a lot more to do with the production code than with what Hitchcock actually wanted to do. I don't think they were allowed to have characters get away with murder. I hadn't read the book in many years or seen the movie again, but I remembered both of them pretty well.
The Hays Code, she said. If only it was that way in real life.
Right.
And he's not a tennis player in the book.
Who?
Guy, the main character. He's an architect.
Oh, right, I said. Was reading the book helpful?
You mentioned in your list that you thought it was the very best example of a perfect murder, she said, ignoring my question. What exactly did you mean?
It's a perfect crime, I said, because when you swap murders with someone else, a stranger, basically, then there is no connection between the murderer and their victim. That's what makes it foolproof.
That's what I've been thinking about, she said. What's clever about the murder in the book, she continued, is that the person committing it can't be connected to the crime. It has nothing to do with the method.
What do you mean? I said.
Bruno kills Guy's wife at an amusement park. He strangles her to death. But there's nothing clever about that. I've been thinking about Charlie's rules again. So, if you were Charlie, just humor me, then how would you commit a murder based on Strangers on a Train?
I see what you mean. It would be very hard.
Right. You could just go strangle someone at an amusement park, but that wouldn't be following the philosophy of the crime.
He'd have to find someone else to commit a murder with him.
That's what I thought, but not necessarily, really, she said. If I were Charlie, if I were trying to copy strangers on a train, then I would select as a victim someone who is already likely to be murdered. My mind is going blank right now, but suppose someone just went through a bitter divorce, or... who's the guy in New York who stole everyone's money? I said. Bernie Madoff? Right, him. He'd work, but there are maybe too many people who want him dead. I would pick one half of a bad divorce, I think. Something slightly public. Then I would wait until the spurned spouse was away and I would commit the murder. I think that would be the best way to honor the book. That makes sense, I said. I think so too. Worth looking into. How about you? Did you have any new thoughts last night? I was pretty tired last night after staying up the night before, so no, but I'll keep thinking about it. Thanks, she said. You've been helpful. Then she added in a slightly different tone of voice, Don't forget to send me your flight information for the trip you took to London this past fall. I'll do that today, I said. After I hung up, Nero came clicking along the hardwood floor to settle himself down by my legs. I watched him in a slight daze, thinking about the phone conversation I'd just had. I did it, came Emily's voice, and I turned around. She was coming toward me, a rare grin on her face. Did what? Sent the email to Popovich. He's going to be in shock. You seem very pleased? No, I'm... You know how much he drives me crazy. It's fine. Honestly, I think he needs us more than we need him. The customer isn't always right, you know. Emily grinned again, then said, Are you feeling okay? I'm fine. Why? Oh, nothing. You seem distracted, that's all. I didn't know if there was anything going on. It was so out of character for her to express this much interest in me that I realized that I must be acting noticeably different. I think of myself as stoic, as someone who never reveals too much of themselves, and it worried me that that might not be the case. Would it be okay if I go for a walk? I said. You can cover the store? Sure. It'll be a quick walk, I said. Outside, it was still bitterly cold, but the sun was out, the sky a hard, unforgiving blue. The sidewalks had been cleared, and I walked toward Charles Street, thinking I'd cut up to the public garden. I kept thinking about the conversation with Gwen about strangers on a train, a book that I'd worked hard at not thinking about for many years. There were more people in the park than I thought there would be, considering the temperature. A father was wiping snow off one of the Make Way for Ducklings bronze figures so that he could put his toddler on top of it and take a picture. I must have walked past those ducklings 1,000 times, and there was always a parent or a set of parents posing their child for a photograph. In summertime, there was often a line. And I always wondered what the parents got out of it, their insistence to document a particular moment. Not being a parent, I don't really know. It was actually something that Claire and I had never talked about, having children. I had told myself it was up to her, but maybe she'd been waiting for me to broach the subject. I walked around the frozen pond, the wind now spinning dead leaves, and started to make my way back to the store. I was not innocent, even though sometimes I allowed myself the luxury of thinking that I was. And if Gwen Mulvey discovered the truth, then I would have to accept it. Chapter 11. I knew that I was going to kill Eric Atwell the moment I'd finished reading Claire's diary. But it took me many more months to work up the courage to admit that to myself. I also knew that when Atwell was dead, I was going to be an immediate suspect. My wife had been coming from his home on the night she died in a car accident. Atwell had even confessed to providing the drugs that were found in her system, and the police, no doubt, had also determined that Claire Kershaw, née Mallory, had been having an affair with the wealthy owner of Black Barn Enterprises. I thought of hiring someone to kill Atwell, then making sure that I was far away, out of the country when it happened. But there were so many reasons this wouldn't work.
For one, I doubted I had the kind of money it would take to hire a professional hitman, and even if I could scrape it together somehow, it would be obvious to anyone looking at my suddenly depleted bank account. I also had no idea how to go about hiring a killer, nor did I even want to support such a profession. Anyone who killed people for money was not someone I wanted to be involved with. Besides, it would be giving someone far too much power over my own life. So I decided that I couldn't hire a killer. But I did like the idea of being far away when Eric Atwell was killed. A year earlier, sometime in 2009, a young woman had come into Old Devil's with a stack of incredibly valuable first editions. They weren't primarily mystery novels, although there had been an 1892 Harper & Brothers edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes that had made me ache with longing. There were about 10 books in all, including 2 Mark Twain firsts that must have been worth thousands, and the woman, who had stringy hair and scabbed lips, had been carrying the books in a grocery bag. I asked her where she got them. "Don't you want them?" she said. "Not if you can't tell me where you got them from." She'd left the store as quickly as she'd come in. In retrospect, I began to wish I'd simply bought them from her with whatever money was in the register, and then I'd have been able to find the owner — she must have robbed someone's home — and returned the books. As it was, I did call the police to report the incident, and they told me they'd keep an eye and an ear out for reports of stolen books. I never heard anything back from them, and I never saw the young woman again. At that time, Old Devil's had an employee named Rick Murphy who worked weekend shifts. Rick was a collector, primarily interested in anything horror-related. I told Rick about the woman who'd come in with the rare first editions. "She might try and sell them online," Rick had said. "She didn't look like the type who goes online." "Worth checking, though," he said. "There's this pretty tasty little site, more of a dark web place, where people sell collectibles under the table." Rick, who worked in IT at an insurance company during the week, showed me a site called Duckburg. To me, it looked nearly incomprehensible, like message boards from the early internet days. But Rick pulled up a section where rare collectibles were offered for sale. It was all anonymous. We did searches for some of the books that had been brought into the store, but nothing popped up. "What else is on here?" I said. "Ah, the gentleman is intrigued. A lot of it is just a place to chat anonymously. To tell the truth, this isn't the true dark web, but it's darkish enough." Rick went to get his gigantic soda, and I quickly bookmarked the page. I thought I might check it out later, but never did. After deciding in late 2010 to kill Eric Atwell, I went to my bookmarks and discovered I still had that link. I spent a few hours one night after closing time exploring the different portals and creating a fake identity, calling myself Bert Kling. Then I logged onto a portal called Swaps that didn't specify exactly what it was for, but primarily seemed to be sexual in nature. 60-year-old man wants to buy you $1,000 in clothes, young and sexy only, won't mind me accompanying you into changing room, no touching, just looking. But there were also offers such as looking for cleaning ladies that want to be paid in oxy. I opened up a dialogue box and wrote, "Any strangers on a train fans out there? Would love to suggest a mutually beneficial swap." I posted it and logged off. I told myself to wait for 24 hours before getting back on, but only managed about 12. It was a quiet day at the store, and I logged back onto Duckburg under my alias. I'd gotten a response. "Big fan of that book. Would love to discuss. Go to private chat?" "Okay," I responded, clicking the box that made the chat visible to only the 2 parties involved. 2 hours later, there was a new message. "What did you have in mind?" I wrote, "There's someone who deserves to disappear from the face of the earth. Can't do it myself, though." I somehow couldn't bring myself to actually write the word die. "I have the same problem," came back almost immediately. Let's help each other out, okay? Okay. My heart was beating, and my ears had gone warm. Was I being trapped? It was possible, but all I had to give up was Eric Atwell's information, not my own. I decided, after about 5 minutes, that it was worth it. I wrote, Eric Atwell, 255 Elsinore Street, Southwell, Mass., anytime from February 6th through February 12th. I was going to be at an antiquarian booksellers conference in Sarasota, Florida during that week. My ticket was already bought. I watched the screen for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, a message appeared. Norman Chaney, 42 Community Road, Tick Hill, New Hampshire, anytime from March 12th through 19th. After that message, another one popped up 30 seconds later. We should never message again. I wrote, agreed. Then I copied down Norman Chaney's address on the back of an Old Devil's bookmark and logged out. From what I understood of Duckburg's policy, the conversation would now disappear forever. It was a comforting thought, even though I doubted its veracity. Taking a deep breath, I realized that I'd been barely breathing for the past 20 minutes. I stared at the name and address I'd written down and was just about to punch it into the computer when I stopped myself. I needed to be more careful than that. There were other ways to find out about this person. Right now, the name was enough. I was glad, I had to admit, that it was a man I was supposed to kill, and I was very glad that I was going second. Obviously, I would only have to go through my half of the bargain if Eric Atwell died while I was in Sarasota. In February 2011, I attended the conference. I'd never been to Sarasota before, and I fell in love with its old brick downtown. I made a pilgrimage to what had been John D. MacDonald's house on Siesta Key, peering through the locked gates at a mid-century modern structure surrounded by lush vegetation. I even attended some presentations and had dinner with one of my few friends in the antiquarian world, Shelley Bingham, who had owned a used bookstore in Harvard Square before retiring to Bradenton, Florida, and selling used books at Anna Maria Island's weekly flea market. We drank martinis at the Gator Club, and after our second, Shelley said, "Now, I was so gutted to hear about Claire last year. How are you doing?" I opened my mouth to speak, but began to cry instead, loudly enough that several heads swiveled toward me. The suddenness and force of the tears was shocking. I stood up and walked to the restroom at the back of the dark bar where I composed myself, then returned to the bar and said, "Sorry about that, Shell." "No, please. I'm sorry I brought it up. Let's have another drink and talk about the books we're reading." It was later that night, back alone in my hotel room, that I got onto my laptop and checked out the Boston Globe's online site. The top story was related to an off-season trade the Red Sox had just made, but the second story was about a homicide in Southwell. The name of the victim had not yet been disclosed by the police. I was tempted to sit with my laptop, refreshing the site until Eric Atwell was named as the victim, but I forced myself to try and sleep instead. I opened the window of my hotel room, lay on the bed under a single sheet, and listened to the breeze, plus the occasional truck rumbling by on the nearby highway. Sometime near dawn, I fell asleep, waking up a few hours later, skin damp with sweat, the sheet twisted around my body. I logged back on to the Globe website. The body that had been found had been identified as Eric Atwell, a prominent local entrepreneur and angel investor. After throwing up in the hotel bathroom, I lay back down on the bed and savored, for a moment, the fact that Atwell had gotten what he deserved. By the time I was back in Boston, I'd learned that Eric Atwell had been reported missing on Tuesday night by one of his housemates. He had gone out on one of his daily walks earlier in the day and had never returned. The following morning, the police conducted a search, and Atwell's body was found near a walking path on conservation land about a mile from his house. He had been shot several times. His wallet had been taken along with an expensive set of headphones and his cell phone. The police were investigating the possibility of a robbery and asking for help from nearby residents. Had anyone seen someone suspicious? Had anyone heard the gunshots? The article went on to mention that Atwell was a renowned philanthropist, someone with a keen interest in the local arts scene, who frequently hosted gatherings and fundraisers at his restored farm in Southwell. The article didn't mention drugs or extortion or anything about Atwell's role in the vehicular death of Claire Mallory. For that, I was glad. A week passed, and I had begun to believe that no one had made any connection between me and Atwell. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, nursing a cold, I was surprised by the sound of the door buzzer. Before I even answered it, I was sure it was the police come to take me away. I braced myself. And it was the police. A tall, sorrowful-looking detective named James, but she did not have the look of a police officer preparing to make an arrest. She said she had a few quick questions. I let her in, and she explained to me that she was a Boston police detective following up on some leads on an unsolved homicide in Southwell. "Did you know Eric Atwell?" she asked after she'd taken a seat on the edge of the sofa. "I didn't, but my wife knew him, unfortunately." "Why, unfortunately?" "I'm sure you know this already because it's why you're here. My wife produced a video for Eric Atwell, and after that they became friends. Claire, my wife, died in a car accident coming home from his house in Southwell." "And did you blame Eric Atwell for this accident?" "I did, partly, at least. I know that my wife started doing drugs again after she met him." The detective nodded slowly. "Did he provide those drugs?" "He did. Look, I know where this is going. I hated Eric Atwell, but I didn't have anything to do with his death. The truth is, my wife had on-again, off-again problems with drugs and alcohol. He didn't force her to start taking drugs. He didn't introduce her to them. Ultimately, it was my wife's decision. I forgave him. It took a lot, but after what happened, I did finally make a decision to forgive him." "So how do you feel now that you know he's been murdered?" I stared at the ceiling as though I were thinking. "Honestly, I don't really know. I'm telling the truth when I say that I forgave him, but that doesn't mean that I liked him. I'm not sad, and I'm not exactly happy. It is what it is. If I'm honest about it, I think he probably got what was coming to him." "So you think he was murdered by someone from a sense of... out of revenge, maybe?" "You mean, do I think he was intentionally murdered, as opposed to just being mugged?" "Right, that's what I mean." The detective was very still, barely moving in the sofa. "It occurred to me. Sure, I can't imagine that my wife is the only one he gave drugs to. And she probably wasn't the only one he started charging after she became addicted. He must have done that to other people." As soon as I spoke the words, I realized it was more than I had wanted to tell the detective. There was something about her calm presence that was making me want to talk. She was nodding again, and when she realized that I had stopped speaking, she said, "Did your wife end up giving a lot of money to Atwell? Money you didn't have?" My wife and I had separate accounts, so I wasn't aware of it at the time. But yes, she started giving money to Atwell for drugs. "I'm sorry to have to ask you this, Mr. Kershaw, but as far as you knew, was there any sexual relationship between your wife and Atwell?" I hesitated. Part of me just wanted to tell this detective everything I had learned from Claire's diary, but I also knew that the more I spoke, the more it became obvious that I had a very serious motive for Atwell's death. I said, "I don't know, to tell the truth. I suspect they might have." Saying the words made my throat start to close a little, as though I were about to cry, and I pressed the heel of my hand against an eye. "Okay," the detective said. "She wasn't herself," I said, unable to stop myself. I mean, because of the drugs. I wiped a tear from my cheek.
I understand. I'm sorry to come out here and make you go through all this again, Mr. Kershaw. I hate to have to do this, but investigations of this kind are often all about the elimination of possible suspects. Do you remember where you were on the afternoon of February 8th?
I was in Florida, actually, at a conference.
Oh, Detective James said, almost looking pleased. What kind of conference was that?
Antiquarian booksellers? I run a used bookstore here in Boston.
Old Devils, right. I've been there.
Really? Are you a mystery fan?
Sometimes, the detective said, and fully smiled for the first time since she'd stepped inside of my apartment. I went to see Sarah Paretsky read about a year ago.
That sounds right, I said. She was good, I thought.
She was. Were you the one who introduced her?
I was. You'll be forgiven if you don't remember me. Public speaking is not my forte.
I think I remember you being fine, she said.
Thank you for that, I said.
Detective James put her hands on her knees and said, Unless you have anything to add, I think we're probably done here.
I don't, I said,
and we stood up at the same time. She was almost exactly my height. I will need some corroboration about the conference in Florida, she said. I promised to send her flight details, and I also gave her Shelley Bingham's name and address. The detective left a card. Her first name was Roberta. Chapter 12. The sign that welcomed me to Tick Hill, New Hampshire, also informed me that the total population was 730 inhabitants. It was March 14th, 2011, a Monday. I had left Boston at just after 5 in the morning, and it was now 8:30. The village of Tick Hill was just north of the White Mountains. I'd done some research on the town and some on Norman Chaney, the man I was there to kill, but not too much. And what research I'd been able to do, I did at a library computer, jumping onto one of the desktops after a patron had left without logging off. I'd had my notebook with me and was able to take notes. What I learned about Tick Hill was that it had 1 diner and 2 bed and breakfasts, both popular because of their proximity to several ski areas. I pulled up a map and got an exact location for Norman Chaney on Community Road. The house, at least according to the map, looked fairly isolated. After sketching the location in my notebook, I began to research Norman Chaney, who had purchased the Tick Hill house 3 years earlier for $225,000. The only other possible hit I got on Norman Chaney was an obituary from 2007 for Margaret Chaney, a schoolteacher from Holyoke in western Massachusetts who had died in a house fire. Margaret Chaney, 47 years old when she died, had left behind 2 children, 22-year-old Finn and 19-year-old Darcy, and her husband of 23 years, Norman Chaney. It wasn't much, but it made me wonder. Could Norman Chaney have been responsible for the death of his own wife? And if so, was that why he'd been marked for death? And was that why he'd left Holyoke to live in a town of less than 1,000 residents? It had occurred to me that I didn't really need to kill Norman Chaney. If Duckburg, the site where I'd arranged the murder swap, was as anonymous as it promised, then there was no way that the stranger I'd communicated with would ever find out who I was. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Even if this stranger, this shadow version of myself, knew nothing about me, he did know one thing. He knew that I wanted Eric Atwell to die. That might put me on a long list, but it also might not. I had decided to go through with my half of the bargain. It seemed the safest thing to do, but also maybe the right thing to do in a twisted way. Before shutting down the library computer, I quickly looked up both Finn Chaney and Darcy Chaney. Unlike their father, they each had online presences. If I'd found the right people, then Finn Chaney was currently working at a small bank in Pittsfield, where he was also a trivia host at a local pub.
Darcy Cheney now lived outside of Boston, attending graduate school at Lesley University in Cambridge. There were pictures of them both, and they were undoubtedly brother and sister. Jet black hair, heavy eyebrows, blue eyes, small mouths. Neither of them seemed to live with their father, and that was the most important piece of information that I got. If Norman Cheney lived alone, then my job became substantially easier. It had just begun to snow as I entered Tick Hill, light flakes that filled the air without seeming to land. I found Community Road, a sparsely populated and poorly paved road that wound up a hill. I slowed down as I approached number 42. The mailbox, painted black with white letters, was the only indication that a property even existed. Driving slowly by, I peered down the dirt driveway but couldn't make out the house in the woods. At the end of Community Road, I U-turned, then made a decision. This time I turned down the driveway. It twisted to the left, and then I could see the house. It was an A-frame construction, more windows than wood, made to look like a miniature ski chalet. I was very happy to see that there was no garage, and that only one vehicle, some kind of SUV, was parked out front. The chances that Norman Cheney was alone just went up significantly. Wearing gloves and with a balaclava on my head, but not pulled all the way down over my face, I stepped out of the car, holding a crowbar down near my leg. I approached the house, stepping up the 2 steps to the front door. It was solid wood, but there was a strip of beveled glass on either side. After ringing the doorbell, I peered into the dark interior of the house, made wonky by the ripple effect of the glass. I'd decided that if anyone other than a middle-aged man came toward the door, I would pull down my balaclava and make my way back to the car. I'd already smeared enough mud on the license plate so that both the number and the state were obscured. No one answered the door. I rang the bell again, a 4-note chime, then saw a large, heavy-set man lumbering slowly down the stairs. Even through the glass, I could see he was wearing gray sweatpants and a flannel shirt. His face was ruddy, and his thick, dark hair was sticking up in tufts as though it was unwashed. The man pulled the door open. There was no fear in his expression, not even any hesitation. "Uh-huh," he said. "Are you Norman Cheney?" I asked. "Uh-huh," he said again. He was over 6 feet tall, even though he stooped slightly, one shoulder noticeably higher than the other. I swung the crowbar, aiming for the side of his head, but Cheney reared back, and the tip of the bar connected with the bridge of his nose. There was a splintery crack as he staggered back, blood falling in a sheet down over his chin. He raised his hands to his face and wetly said, "The fuck?" Stepping into the house, I swung the crowbar again, but Cheney easily blocked it with his meaty left arm, then swung at me with his right, batting me in the shoulder with a fist. It didn't hurt, but it knocked me off balance for a moment, and Cheney charged, grabbing me by my tracksuit in both fists, shoving me up against a wall. Something, probably a coat hook, jabbed me high up in my back. Warm blood was spraying from Cheney's nose, hitting me in the face. Some memory, probably from an Ian Fleming novel, went through my panicked mind, and I raised my right foot, bringing my heavy boot down hard on Cheney's instep. Cheney grunted and loosened his grip, and I pushed forward as he stumbled backward, both of us falling after a few steps, me landing on top of him, hard, hearing something snap. Cheney's face contorted, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from the water. I pushed myself off his body, then put a knee on his chest and leaned on top of him again. He struggled to breathe, and I put my gloved hands around his thick neck and squeezed, pressing as hard as I could with my thumbs. He tried to pull my hands loose, but he was already weakening. I closed my eyes and kept squeezing. After about a minute, or it might have been longer, I stopped and rolled off to the side, breathing heavily and aware that my mouth was salty and thick with blood. I ran my tongue around my teeth, but it was the tip of my tongue that was ragged and painful. I must have bit it during the fight. Blood was filling my mouth, and I swallowed it. It seemed a bad idea to spit a mouthful of my own blood onto the scene of a crime, even though I knew I'd probably left all sorts of DNA traces already. Crouching in front of Cheney, and without directly looking at him, I felt for a pulse in both his neck and his wrist. There was none. I stood, the world wobbling around me for a moment, then bent to pick up the crowbar. I had decided earlier that I would need to go through the house, take a few valuables after Cheney was dead, but I didn't know if I had it in me. I just wanted to be back in the car, heading as far away from what had just happened as possible. I was about to turn when movement from the corner of my eye made me look across the foyer toward the open-plan living room with floor-to-ceiling windows. A ginger cat was making its way slowly toward me, its unclipped nails clicking on the hardwood floor. The cat stopped and sniffed at Cheney's body, then looked again at me and meowed loudly, taking 2 steps closer, then flopping onto its side and stretching out to show its white, tufted stomach. A wave of almost paralyzing cold swept through my body, a premonition that for the rest of my life this one image, this cat asking for love while its owner lay murdered on the floor, would haunt me forever. Without thinking, I bent down and scooped up the cat, bringing it with me out to my car and driving away. The snow had picked up and had now begun to stick to the roads. I drove slowly, reversing my route back through Tick Hill's town center, then picking up the highway that would lead me through the White Mountains and south to Massachusetts. My movements in the car felt slow and deliberate, and even the car itself felt like it was moving through air that had turned into something close to solid. Time had slowed down, and everything was suffused with a sense of unreality. I looked down at the passenger seat where I'd put the docile cat. Some part of my brain was yelling that you never take anything from the scene of a crime, telling me I'd just signed my death warrant. But I kept driving. The cat was now looking up toward the window at the snowflakes flying by the car. There was no collar. I reached a hand out and rubbed the cat along its spine. It was thinner than I thought, most of its bulk coming from its thick orange fur. I thought I could detect a tiny purr vibrating through my fingertips. Once I was through the mountains and my mind had started to clear a little, I made the decision that I would pull over into some random town, look for a store or an inn, someplace with an unlocked door, and slide the cat inside. He or she would be found and taken to a shelter. There was a huge risk that someone would see me, but I had to try. I should never have taken the cat, and I couldn't even remember now why I had done it. But now that the cat was in the car, I couldn't bring myself to simply push it out onto the side of the road. That would be the prudent thing to do, but the cat's chances of survival would be so slim. I kept driving, and somewhere in southern New Hampshire the cat put its head down and went to sleep. I hadn't pulled over in any random town, and I suddenly knew that I wasn't going to. When I arrived back in Beacon Hill and found a parking spot right in front of my building, the cat was still with me. I scooped it up and took it upstairs. It was 10:30 in the morning. While the cat padded around my small apartment, sniffing and rubbing its cheek along every piece of furniture, I stripped off all my clothes and put them, along with the crowbar, into a heavy-duty garbage bag. Then I showered, soaping up and rinsing off at least 3 times until the hot water began to run out. In my original plan for the day, I was going to leave Cheney's house, then drive slightly north to a used bookstore I knew that was in an old refurbished barn. I'd been there multiple times and in the past had had luck finding rare editions of crime novels. If for some reason I wound up being a suspect in Cheney's death, if my car had been spotted by someone, then at least I'd have had some reason for being in New Hampshire on that particular Monday. It was a very thin alibi, but it was better than nothing. I suppose that now I could say that I was planning on driving to a favorite bookstore, but turned back because of the snow. Of course, none of that would explain the presence of a murdered man's cat in my apartment, a cat that was now rubbing its chin up against my ankle. I found a can of tuna, tipped it into a bowl, then filled a second bowl with water. I also found the lid from a cardboard box and scattered some dirt from one of my spider plants into it, hoping it would work as a litter box. While the cat ate, I went onto my computer and did a Google search to find out how to know if a cat was male or female. After some poking around, I decided that the cat was male. I spent the day inside with him, at one point both of us sleeping together on the sofa, the cat down by my feet. Toward nightfall, he'd found his way onto the bed, and he curled up on my current book, a paperback copy of Rex Stout's Too Many Cooks. I named the cat Nero. 1 month later, 1 month after I had left Norman Chaney's corpse in Tick Hill, New Hampshire, two things were clear. One, the police weren't coming for me. Even though I hadn't gone online to look up anything about the Chaney murder case, I felt deep in my bones that I'd gotten away with it. The second realization was that Nero, who'd taken to his new home pretty happily, needed more people around him. I was often gone for 12 hours at a time, and when I returned home, Nero was right at the door, desperate for affection. Mary Ann, my downstairs neighbor, told me she could hear him crying during the day. I was beginning to think that Nero would make an excellent store cat at Old Devil's.